Nintendo stole this game and got sued $14 million. Well, I mean, that's a pretty big claim to make. Stealing! Nintendo would surely never do that. They shut down fan projects all the time for just trying to make something fun from the franchises that they own, but they wouldn't steal something, surely? That's not their MO, or is it? Let's find out.
Nintendo's biggest arcade hit, Donkey Kong, was stolen from another developer.
No.
About how Nintendo illegally produced thousands of copies of the game. And about how Nintendo got sued for 580 million yen because of it.
You're telling me that good guy Nintendo, the person that, or it's not the person, the company that shuts down all these fan projects that aren't getting paid because they have the same things as their main series games, they're doing the same thing and well, they're not doing it. It was a long time ago, but still, I want to hear about this. This sounds like it's some kind of like medieval fantasy. The shadow from beyond the wall.
The story starts back in the early 1980s. For decades, Nintendo had been one of Japan's biggest toy manufacturers. But in the early 70s, the company began branching out into the world of arcade games.
And
pinball. The only problem was that Nintendo didn't have a single programmer working at the company. So if you look at Nintendo's early arcade games, almost none of them were developed by Nintendo themselves.
I'll do it, I'll develop for them.
Nintendo struck a deal with a company called Ikegame Tsushinki. So
it can't be that hard to develop a game back then. You just have to write a few lines of code where it's like, if ball hit wall, add point to other side.
Ikegame
Boom,
would build the hardware and write the code, while Nintendo built the physical arcade cabinets themselves and marketed the games. Now, nobody outside of Nintendo is 100% sure which games Ikegame Tsushinki actually created for Nintendo.
Wait, what? They didn't credit them?
The deal meant that Ikegame never took any credit for the games they created.
Oh, however, what? That's crazy. They didn't even get paid a little bit of exposure. I mean, they got paid in money, but that's crazy. You have to credit. But even like YouTubers, when a video gets edited by someone else and they're like, hey, can you credit me in the description? I credit the editors that want to be credited in the description. When someone paints a thumbnail or draws a thumbnail for me, I credit them in the description. That's messed up. You can't just not have credits. There's a reason why every game ends with credits.
The games Ikegame worked on, you can often find little hints left by the game's creators.
They have to sneak in hints?
For instance, can be found hidden
please give me
inside
credit.
multiple arcade games of the 1980s. And inside the original ROM for Donkey Kong, you can find an even more obvious clue. This message can be found inside.
The message states, Nintendo did not make this game, I did. Fuck them guys.
Congratulations. If you analyze difficult this program, we would teach you. Telephone Tokyo, Japan 044-244-2151, extension 304, system design, Ikegame Co. Limited.
Do you think that if you did that, you could actually get a job back in the day? Do you think anyone actually did that? Obviously, if you phone it now, nothing's gonna happen. But if you called that up, you'd be like, hey, I analyze difficult this program. They'd be like, oh, you're hired.
That's right. Within the code for Donkey Kong, there's a message offering a job to anyone who manages to get inside the game's data.
I'm gonna call them now. Fuck this YouTube thing. I'm sick of it. I'm gonna go program Donkey Kong instead. Bye, guys.
And written right there is the name of the developer, Ikegame. But before we get to Donkey Kong, we need to talk about another really important arcade game, Radar Scope. Now, Radar Scope is nowadays best known as the game that got turned into Donkey Kong. But when it was released in Japan in 1980, Radar Scope was actually quite a hit. It too was developed by Ikegame Tsushinki. They built the game's motherboard and all the hardware the game needed to run. They programmed all the code too. In fact, it's even rumored that Ikegame Tsushinki actually came up with the idea of the game in the first place, not Nintendo.
Damn, Ikegame got scammed, huh?
Just a rumor. Now,
they got scammed.
This next part of the story is probably a little more familiar. Nintendo at the time were just branching out into the United States, and seeing the success of Radar Scope, they placed an order of 3,000 units of the game, which...
Okay, I thought they were gonna say 300,000. They said 3,000 units. I'm like, oh, well, you know, it was a bit smaller back then. There weren't as many massive nerds like me playing video games.
Duly manufactured and sent over to America. The only problem, nobody in America liked the game.
Oh, guys, come on, it's awesome. What do you mean?
Nintendo of America managed to shift 1,000 units, just about. But
damn,
they still left
they fell off.
2,000 highly advanced and highly expensive arcade cabinets just sitting in their warehouse.
What a
With the
shame.
company's future under threat, Nintendo of America's president, Minoru Arakawa, asked his father-in-law and president of Nintendo.
Damn, that family has some big beaming smiles. You tell me that's the father-in-law? They got some big happy grinners.
Yamauchi to have a new game developed that could run on those 2000 arcade machines. Yamauchi
they just do a little rebranding.
New designer at the company, Shigeru Miyamoto, to come up with the
Miyamoto!
game that Nintendo of America had requested.
Let's go!
Miyamoto had no
Dude, he's been there so
skills when
long.
it came to arcade games, but he drew up hundreds of detailed sketches and plans for the game which would soon become Donkey Kong.
It's him.
Then
It's the guy.
He sent all of those details off to Ikegame Tsushinki.
Okay, a little bit of a side note. It's cool to see Miyamoto here, but whenever I look at streets in Japan, they look like a cable manager's nightmare. Because all of those like light posts and power posts have cables that are like strewn all over the place. And it just looks like an absolute nightmare. It looks like one could swing down and end your life in an instant.
Where a team of 6 developers brought his idea to life over the course of 3 months. After all, Ikegame Tsushinki had designed radar scope's hardware, so they were likely the only ones who knew it well enough to retrofit a brand new game onto hardware which was never designed for it. Now, those 6 developers' names are actually known, so let me read them to you now. There were 4 programmers, Hirohisa Kominome, Minoru Inuma, Mitsuhiro Nishida, and Yasuhiro Murata. And then 2 more developers worked on the
Yasuhiro
ROM
is such a
itself,
cool name.
Shigeru Kudo and Kenzo Sekaguchi.
Kenzo
Those
is such
6
a good
developers
name.
Are the forgotten creators of Donkey Kong.
Japan has some
perhaps the
sick
most
names.
important arcade game ever. And for their work on the game, Ikegame was paid 10 million yen, just under $300,000 US dollars, adjusted
That's respectable.
for inflation.
Wait, is that for the whole company? Is that enough to run a company off of? I don't know how many. I mean, if there was 6 people and it was $300,000, if you divide that by 6, that's what, $50,000 per person? Then you're also gonna have to take out a ton of money for a bunch of other overhead costs when it comes to the business, right? So they're probably getting paid a lot less than that.
The contract between the companies
I don't know if
stated
it's a
that
scam.
Nintendo wasn't allowed to produce copies of the games themselves, nor were they allowed to authorize any other company to do so. Now, Ikegame Tsushinki created 2,000 conversion kits, which could be used to convert a radar scope arcade machine into one that could play Donkey Kong. Nintendo themselves created 2,000 stickers, which could be stuck over all the branding for radar scope.
That's just stickers. You just put them over it. Okay, that's kind of funny, not
And
gonna
then-
lie. Also, a conversion kit. You need a whole ass conversion kit just to change one game into another.
The 3 employees working at Nintendo of
Technology
America
didn't exist
were
back in the
tasked
day.
with converting those 2,000 cabinets into the new game by hand, one by one. And so,
Sounds like an
Nintendo
absolute
were
nightmare.
quite pleased, you can imagine, when Donkey Kong went on to become a hit in America. Actually, it was more than a hit, it was a phenomenon. So popular was Nintendo's new arcade game that Nintendo immediately ordered around 8,000 more units of Donkey Kong from Ikegame Tsushinki.
It's because Mario's Italian, and there, there's a lot of Italian Americans. The mafia really loved Donkey Kong and back in the day. It's true facts.
Nintendo's contract gave Ikegame exclusive rights to manufacture Donkey Kong hardware at the price of 70,000 yen per game, about 1,700 US dollars adjusted for
Okay.
inflation.
That's a
However,
decent chunk.
It was at this point that Nintendo committed their first of 2 crimes.
Uh-oh.
Presumably fed up with waiting for Ikegame to produce more arcade machines, or perhaps not wanting to pay the fees demanded by the company, Nintendo began illegally copying the ROMs produced by Ikegame Tsushinki
Nintendo.
and produced
You illegally copied ROMs? Nintendo! I thought you were completely against that.
Using
What's going on? Subscribe to the second
for
channel.
Donkey Kong hardware themselves. That way, they could ship this hardware to America and sell more Donkey Kong arcade machines without any involvement from the game's developer, Ikegame.
Evil
ended up
Nintendo.
producing about 80,000 Donkey Kong arcade machines this way, which utterly dwarfs
Oh,
the
that's a
8,000
scam.
machines they ordered legitimately. Now, obviously,
Jesus Christ,
this
10 times
completely
more.
went against the terms of Nintendo's contract with Ikegame Tsushinki, especially since Ikegame believed that they owned the rights to Donkey Kong's code, not Nintendo.
How did they think they were going to get away with that? They just ship off 72,000 more versions of Donkey Kong to the US? Ikegame's like, where'd you get all those Donkey Kongs? Nintendo's like, I don't know. I found them on the street. Yeah, they're just there lying
We'll get to
around.
more details on that later. But here's the thing. It wasn't actually this first crime, this illegal production of 80,000 Donkey Kong machines, that got Nintendo in legal trouble. No,
they just let that slide.
Came 1 year later.
Can't believe they thought they'd get away with this.
The sequel. So,
I love Part 2s.
With Donkey Kong a huge hit in the US, the obvious next move for Nintendo was to produce a sequel. Again, Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, asked Shigeru Miyamoto to design this game, which Miyamoto was delighted about. So many of Miyamoto's ideas for the original Donkey Kong arcade game had been cut to get the game done in time. But now he had a chance to use some of those ideas. The basic plan for this new Donkey Kong game was to reverse the roles. This time, Mario
That's
would
progressive.
be the enemy, not the hero. At first, Miyamoto wanted to have Donkey Kong as the player character, but Donkey Kong was too big to move around on screen.
See, it's all pre-watched.
He would fill most of it. So, Miyamoto instead created a new character to fill this role, Donkey Kong Jr., the game's namesake.
I didn't realize that
at this point,
that's basically Diddy Kong, right? I didn't realize that Diddy Kong was such an old character.
Nintendo had started hiring more game development staff, like programmers. And so, instead of having Ikegame Tsushinki develop the game and giving them exclusive rights to sell it to Nintendo, this time, Nintendo would develop Donkey Kong Jr. in-house.
Are they allowed to do that because they don't own the rights to the Donkey Kong character and franchise, do they? Or they shouldn't? Ikegame should hold that.
That was fine. There was no reason Nintendo couldn't do that.
Never mind, I'm an idiot. I'm dumb. Sorry.
Donkey Kong Jr. was going to reuse a lot of
they can't use the code, right? They can't use the code.
Donkey Kong. Nintendo figured, why should their in-house programmers have to build the sequel from scratch? Instead, Nintendo wanted to reuse the code that Ikegame Tsushinki had written for the game. But Nintendo didn't ask Ikegame Tsushinki for that code.
Did they just
didn't draw
scam
up
it?
some agreement between the two companies. Instead, Nintendo went behind Ikegame's back. They
Oh my
hired
God.
a different company called Iwasaki Giken to reverse engineer Donkey Kong's source code based on
Guys!
the ROMs that Ikegame Tsushinki had produced for Nintendo.
Dude, this is so clearly wrong. Like, do you think that you're the good guy in this scenario? When you're planning to do this, you're just like, ooh, we're going to do a little evil. We're going to do a little scamming on a smaller company.
Now, Nintendo did not legally own that source code. It was the property of Ikegame. But secretly, Nintendo used that reverse engineered
stealing,
code
guys.
as the basis for their sequel, Donkey Kong Jr. An estimated 66.3% of Donkey Kong Jr.'s source
That's
code
very
is
precise.
identical to the code written by Ikegame Tsushinki. About 2/3 of the game was plagiarized. And
Damn, I mean, at that point, you just have to give 2/3 of the profits from the game to Ikegame because they have 2/3, they made 2/3 of the game.
Ikegame found out, they were not pleased. And so began the legal troubles. Part
Nintendo
3,
deserves to
the
get slapped for
lawsuit.
this one.
So, in 1983, Ikegame Tsushinki filed a lawsuit against Nintendo for copyright infringement to the
Rightfully.
tune of 580 million yen, about $14 million adjusted for inflation.
But did they
The suit
win? Did they
encompassed
win?
both Nintendo's illegal production of those 80,000 Donkey Kong arcade machines.
See, if you're gonna break the law, only do it once. They would have gotten away with the Donkey Kong machines if it wasn't for them stealing the code at the same time. If you never break the law twice in one sesh. Like, if you're gonna be a drug dealer, don't speed at the same time or you'll get
alongside
pulled
the
over.
use of Ikegame's code in Donkey Kong Jr. So, who was in the right?
Ikegame.
Well, the deal between the two companies never specified who the copyright owner of the code was. At the time, computer code...
Ikegame wrote the code, so if it doesn't specify the person that owns it, then surely, by default, it would go to the people that created it because they put the labor in to make
wasn't
it.
even protected under Japanese copyright law.
Oh, Japanese
So,
copyright law is
this
insane.
made things pretty murky. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi made the following statement at the time. This lawsuit is hard to understand. When
I
we
can't
developed
read.
Donkey Kong, which was put on the market
I never
in
learned how to read.
1981, we outsourced the development of software to Ikegame Tsushinki. We paid for it, and it was all over. Since Donkey Kong sold explosively, mainly in the American market, it is presumed that they filed their suit under the advice of lawyers. And so...
Oh, so they're saying, oh, because it's popular now they want a cut of the pie, they want a slice of the old shebang.
This 1983 lawsuit continued on for the next 7 years. In those 7 years, Ikegame Tsushinki left the video game industry entirely, moving their focus to medical equipment instead.
Damn, imagine being so depressed that your video game got stolen, you started making like x-rays instead.
In 1989, 6 years later, Japan's copyright law was revised, and computer code became copyrightable. And 1 year later, in 1990, it was decided in court that Ikegame was the legal owner of Donkey Kong's
Oh, damn. Was that retroactive? So you introduce a law in 1989 and then you use that to decide a case from 1983? Can you do stuff retroactively like that? That seems weird, going forward and changing the laws and then retroactively looking at a case from before those laws were in place and being like, oh, Steve, the laws have changed, so now you have to pay up. That's kind of weird.
Nintendo owned the characters, the gameplay, the idea of the game, the name Donkey Kong even, but Ikegame owned that original code. And that same year, Nintendo and Ikegame struck a deal out of court. The details of that deal...
Something that they could have done originally, but I guess they just didn't know that they didn't own it. Surely they would have known. At the very least, you get in contact with the company like, hey, we're gonna make a sequel. What's going on with the code? And not hire a different company entirely to reverse engineer a ROM. You know you're doing something wrong at that point.
The deal were never made public, but a large sum of money almost certainly changed hands in 1990. Which may
probably
have
not
had
14
an
million.
Interesting effect, because 2 years after Donkey Kong appeared in arcades, Nintendo themselves ported the game to their new home console, the NES. And since that port was done by Nintendo themselves, they wrote the code from scratch, and they owned that code.
They had to completely rebuild it.
Every time that Donkey Kong has been re-released by Nintendo since then, it's always been the NES version, not the arcade version.
Because they didn't own it.
Over the last 40 years, there have only been 2 exceptions to that rule. In 2018, the game Arcade Archives Donkey Kong was released, a faithful port of the original Donkey Kong arcade game.
How did they do that,
though? In 1999,
because they came to the conclusion that Ikegame owns the code, so did they pay them for it?
Came out, also featuring the full original arcade version of Donkey Kong. For years, it was
kind of weird
that the game's developers, Rare, must have snuck this game past Nintendo without them noticing.
We do a little sneaking.
According to Mark Stevenson, a developer on the game, Rare just asked Nintendo, and they said yes. So perhaps the Ikegame Tsushinki saga wasn't the real reason
they might have bought the rights to do it.
Never re-released Donkey Kong's arcade version. Perhaps they just didn't want to.
Maybe they were just angry at it. They were like, fuck this arcade version, I hate it.
Know the truth.
Made us lose so much money.
Specifically Shigeru Miyamoto, was of course instrumental in the creation of Donkey Kong. The whole game was Miyamoto's idea from the start, and he planned out every last detail.
Aw, Miyamoto is awesome.
Donkey Kong. But there's another side to the story. Those 6 developers from Ikegame Tsushinki.
Did they ever get credited?
That Nintendo betrayed. And I think those 6 developers deserve to be remembered for their part in creating the world's most influential arcade game.
Yeah, they're awesome. They're great. They're great. Well,
thanks for watching.
Guess who else is also great? The creator of this video, Thomas Game Docs, makes fantastic videos. So please make sure that you do. Make sure subscribe to him as well. Jesus Christ, can't finish the sentence. Subscribe to this channel, and I stream every day on YouTube. Bye.